Okay, welcome everyone to the people here sitting in the audience in front of me and to the people joining us remotely through our YouTube stream. Thank you so much for being here. This is Questions About Music, a series of conversation hosted by the UofA Department of Music. And it's a forum, think of it as a forum for everyone, really, performers, composers, academics, fans, family, friends, to come together and chat about musical things that make us curious. Just as any colloquium series, we have invited guests, sometimes joining from within the department, sometimes joining from outside. And we want to converse on a variety of topics, really, but without, just because we have so many other of those kind of formats, without formal presentations, without formal papers. So everything takes more the shape of a conversation with people. But the very title of Questions About Music, it's because this kind of platform, we wanted also for people within the community, from student, graduate student, undergraduate student, staff, to come to us and say, we have a question about music we'd like to discuss. Or can you guys invite this person and ask these questions? Because we're curious to engage with them in a conversation. So it's really supposed to be our ideas about what we want to discuss, but also yours ideas. So don't forget to get in touch with us at the end of this or via email about things that you'd like to see, questions that you'd like to be asked in this forum. And towards the end of this session, I'll also give you an idea about some of the things that we got cooking for next term. But today, here and now, it's me, Fabio Morabito. I'm a musicologist here at the University of Alberta. And I'm here with my colleague Patrick Nickleson, who is also a musicologist here in the department. And he joined the department only this past year, so he's still quite new. And we are tremendously lucky to have Patrick, and to also to have this occasion today to talk about the real star of the show is Patrick, to get to know him a bit better, but also his brand new book, The Names of Minimalism, Authorship, Art, Music, and Historiography in Dispute, which came out just in January of this year, 2023. Well done, exactly. And we'll chat about the book, about some of the insights, some of the questions that we wanted to sort of like ask after this book came out. And but just to give you a sense of the format, there's going to be kind of like maybe a half an hour of conversation of question between me and Patrick. And then the rest of the event is questions from the audience and questions from the online participants that I'm able to see the question they're going to be asking from, because I can read the chat. So don't hesitate to write in the chat, people that are joining from afar. I'll be able to read aloud your questions and integrate them in the discussion. And then last but not least, of course, this wouldn't be a proper colloquium series without a drink afterwards. And join us for the après Questions About Music for our reception if you're here in town. It would be our pleasure to treat you to some of these and have some even more informal conversation on the topics or other topics that you'd like to discuss and see represented on this platform. But without further ado, Patrick, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tonight. Thank you so much for agreeing on chatting with me about your book. I'm so excited. And maybe I thought we could start by the very first word in your title, the idea of names. Because normally when people ask me, what do you do for work? I say, like, I'm a musicologist. The next question is like, oh, which composers do you work on? Or what is your favorite composer? Which is kind of like one of the two questions. And already that kind of question has a bit of baggage, right? Because immediately it assumes that if you are interested in music, you work on composers, on authors, on some names. So maybe could you tell us a bit more how, through the experience of your book, but also through your own work, even that very questions about names comes with some baggage. It's almost like a bit policing without quite getting there, almost implicitly policing how we think about music through names.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you. I think of like names, and then I think of probably like 10 ways that goes in the book under it. And the one you're saying I think is really true, where a lot of people tend to assume that as music historians that we're like dealing in a list of names and pieces and dates, and the first piece to do this and the second piece to do that, and the kind of those sort of orders of priority, which doesn't much interest me, and I think is quite different than what most music scholars do these days. But yeah, in with that title, I'm also referring to, there's a philosopher who the book is very much about named Jacques Rancière, who has a book called The Names of History. So it's kind of also punning on that book. But then too, that minimalism, I mean, not more than most kind of styles of music, but alongside things like the VNU school and the second VNU school, there has tended to be a real focus on a handful of composers that people think of as the minimalists. And the book kind of simultaneously is very, very, very focused on them and very much trying to critique what holds them together as a group. And so one thing to point to with that too is that I think a lot of the really good research that's happened recently in relation to minimalism has been about expanding the kind of canon beyond those composers. My good friends Will Robin and Carrie O'Brien have just done a book called On Minimalism too, where the real goal, one of their goals, as I understand it, or as I was explained in brief, is to kind of expand from that really small group of composers to a lot of composers, and to kind of notice the kind of minimalist impulse in a lot of places. And I've always felt a bit uncomfortable personally with kind of trying to take that approach, because I think there's just still a lot to be said in terms of how we got to those four and why we have those four, what kind of methods you need to use to try to expand out from those four, what kind of things you assume. And so for me, it's like this kind of idea of names is something where, both in terms of authors' names and the baggage that that carries, but also the names of concepts and the names of places and the way we kind of name different periods, and that all those kind of things have a way of becoming kind of too stable, and using those as a starting point to then kind of go backwards and dig into how they kind of came together, rather than using them as a starting point to then investigate styles or formalism or whatever else.
This is so interesting, because there's so much call at the moment for our field to not necessarily destabilize, but rethink the canon, for example. And one could think about the canon of minimalism, and one could say, like, who else was involved aside from these four people, no? And including, all the collaborators that were there, the performers, and also maybe names and voices that were erased, and that's certainly important work that is happening in our field. But I also find it fascinating that you say, like, wait a moment, but how about those four and how they came into be as a canon, and what are the structure that made us think about those four kings of the minimalism, whatever we want to talk about the main names.
No, even
exactly.
Worse, yeah.
It's even worse. But yeah, so, and I see your book really doing this sort of archaeology of how we got there, and we're gonna, maybe we should say also for people that maybe not necessarily super familiar with minimalism, right? No one should necessarily be already familiar with this. So how do these people, these names, these minimalists, is normally talked about in histories of music? So giving some context, but also because I think it's quite important, because you sort of challenge how we tell the story of these people, of these musicians, of these composers.
Yes, I mean, the big famous people that I think if people tend to know minimalism that they might often know are like Steve Reich and Philip Glass and Lamont Young and Terry Riley. And again, a lot of the most important work in the last decade or so has been about saying is also Julius Eastman and Ellen Fullman, and I know in Will and Carey's book that someone like Alice Coltrane, even Miles Davis become important figures, or McCoy Tyner, the pianist, or all these different figures that you can draw into it. I think the thing that's been important to me is to say that what made that initial group of four people together make sense in the first place. And I do kind of move beyond those four as well too, but they're kind of this kind of like intense buzzing set of pairs in the book, because they kind of came together through really close collaborative processes that were very, very different from how we tend to understand how composers work. As in, they didn't sit down and write scores and hand them off to performers and then have the pieces played. They tended to be composer-performers working in dialogue with other performers who are also often composers and making pieces. They very often kind of evaded working with scores. They prioritized, they were kind of the first generation to have like cheap tape recorders. So they'd often just have tape players running at their rehearsals, and they would kind of use that to build the piece rather than a score. And so in a lot of this music, the kind of things that people have focused on in terms of formal concerns have been things like a return to diatonicism after like decades of serialist priority, long durations and drone, things like gradual processes in relation to Steve Reich and his essay Music as a Gradual Process, often tuning. So there's all these kind of formal characteristics that get treated, again, when you start from the composers and then build to stylistic traits and then use those stylistic traits to expand the canon to more composers. I think you're, again, still missing what I prioritize, which is that all those stylistic traits came out of the fact that they weren't writing first. They were rehearsing and collaborating and living in lofts together and going to a lot of pop concerts and John Coltrane concerts. And I'm trying to treat that as the primary kind of unifying compositional thing, which again, none of that's ever been unacknowledged, but it's never been treated as kind of the narrative center as far as I've seen it. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that they were all in such close dynamic interrelation, including when they made the pieces that we tend to think of, like music for 18 musicians or in C, or music in fifths, and those kind of pieces. They were like practically all living together. They weren't quite, but they were in constant conversation and contact and sharing resources and promoting each other's shows. And I just consider that to be kind of the foundational unifying thing, where a lot of the histories to date treat that as kind of a pre-story to them all kind of coming into dispute over who did what first, or whose idea something was, or other kinds of things that come down to, you know, money and prestige and priority and those kind of things. And so people have tended to treat those early collaborations as kind of a utopian moment that inevitably led towards them breaking up, whereas I'm saying they can only break up because they had a moment together, which is nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I find it so fascinating that you focus on how this music came about, and that kind of like is a bit the inspiration for looking at this. And but why do you think then? Because if you take a music history book and you open it, it says Riley in C. It's quite the name of the composition connected to the author. So this is how we tell this story. And I was wondering, why do you think that's the case? And what are we missing more importantly? You know, why is this collaboration sort of kind of erased or set aside or seen as something early and not very good, maybe?
I'm pausing because there's like too many answers. I think a lot of it has to do with, I think one of the kind of framing ideas in the book too is that I think it kind of feels kind of tragic to me that part of the reason I think these composers kind of came into dispute and stopped, you know, getting along well and collaborating has to do with the kinds of documents and stories and oral history and autobiography you need to get together to impress people like us, to have us be convinced that you're worth writing about, or that you might fit into my article or my book or my textbook or whatever. And so I think that's a big part of it, is that the format that music history tends to be taught in requires them to kind of like in the case of a lot of these musicians, they kind of made these pieces without scores, but then into the 80s and the 90s they would have, rather speaking generally, so let's say Steve Reich, for example, hired the composer Mark Melitz, who's a prominent composer now too, I'm framing the details here, but in the mid-80s, let's say, to transcribe music for 18 musicians.
Right.
So it had never existed as a piece before. It had been never existed as a piece in the Western art music sense. It had been something that Reich's ensemble, who are incredible and like live and breathe that piece, had toured the world forever and taught other percussionists and taught students. And then essentially Melitz was hired to transcribe the score from the record, like note for note, and that's the score that Boozy and Hawkes eventually published. So there's these kind of things where the institutional requirements of pedagogy and music history and copyright and, you know, money, getting paid and having a career and living, I think really require us to demand of somebody to go back into those scenes and like grab things, like pluck out the things. And I think we too often assume that those are the most notable or the most worthwhile things, when often they're just like the most exciting story to tell, or the kind of, you know, the best gig or the funniest anecdote or whatever. And so I'm trying to put them back into those things and think about what relations there were that are, I think, just good stories of, you know, interpersonal decency and relation and humanity and stuff, rather than the competitive drive that people, I think, want often.
Yeah, I think, you know, in your book you're quite clear about how much we have sort of like inherited this model of authorship, kind of like from the 19th century genius, to be brief that.
Your world.
Exactly, my word, it's my fault. It's the fault of my people. So it's incredible how much you do so well in your book that it reminded me when people talk about race-neutral language in normal conversation, and then you go to a music history class, and it's not about race-neutral, but it's almost like author-neutral. You assume that authorship is a certain thing because we have inherited this way of being a musical author as something that it's professionalized, that it's worthy to be in the musical museum, it's worthy to become part of the music history book. But all these things are kind of in one package, and people sort of like neutrally assume that when you talk about a composer, you're talking about that kind of thing, and you need to kind of like tick these boxes to be one. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this minimalist composer felt some of that pressure when trying to police these earlier collaborations and making them? The story of Lamont Young asking people to sign, that's quite something.
Yeah, and that one is anecdotal. So actually, the cover of the book,
Right.
There's some, for those people that are in the room, there's some flyers there if you want to order the book, you can get a discount. But you can also get it for free. It's open access, so just free online. But the cover of the book is a photo of Lamont Young on the left and Tony Conrad on the right, who were two artists who worked in very close collaboration in the mid to late 60s, essentially playing like drones for hours at a time, every day, for years straight. And they called the group the Theater of Eternal Music. So chapter 2 is all about them. But the photo on the cover is from a 1990 protest in very silly scare quotes, where Tony Conrad went to a performance by Lamont Young in Buffalo in, I think, April 1990, and picketed his concert by himself. So he had a big placard, and he was handing out pamphlets that essentially said that Lamont Young doesn't understand his work. And the idea there being that Tony Conrad viewed their collaboration as being entirely egalitarian, and that they performed drones because that allowed them not to have a composer, and they could deliberate everything in conversation and have it be all very diplomatic, not diplomatic, democratic. Whereas Lamont Young retroactively chose to view those performances as his music that they were playing. And so Tony Conrad, being kind of an eminent, deeply critical but also very funny kind of person, just picketed the concert and stood outside and tried to discourage people from going in and stuff. And I love that because it's from 1990, looking back at the mid-60s, and kind of that moment in 1990s when all the histories of this music started, and when I think Boozy and Hawkes would have published the Music of 18 score around then, and a lot of the very important books on minimalism came out in the 90s, and magazines like The Wire in the UK were writing about minimalism a lot and giving it a big audience. And so, there's this sense that these disputes kind of emerge from people trying to sort out those past histories. And when you're in close collaboration and you're in a loft, and they did a lot of drugs too, these two at least, a lot of drugs. And so when they were in these lofts and they had tape recorders and piles of drugs and they were droning for 8 hours at a time, it's kind of part of the sort of theoretical framing for the book is to say that it'd be pretty easy to both misunderstand what you were doing together. And to both leave with pretty different senses of what was happening. And not just, in the sense of they were high, whatever, just that you can see how people could have different views of what's going on while it works and gets along still. But then 25 years later, when one's trying to release CDs of the music under his own name and tries to give release forms to the performers, and they turn that down and start picketing each other's shows, I try to make the case that kind of that's when minimalism starts, not in the mid-60s, but in that kind of moment of recognizing that no one agreed of what they were talking about. And this is one of the big things from that philosopher Rancière too, is this idea of disagreements not being about one person saying yes and one saying no, but about both people agreeing but not actually talking totally at cross purposes in some sense. He uses the term la mésentente, which in French kind of means mishearing as well as misunderstanding, but also, I don't know the French this well, but it's written about as being kind of about a familial bad blood kind of dynamic too, that it's you can't resolve this by more conversation or more dialogue. It's something that goes past the conversation. So there's this very lovely kind of Rancièrean idea of maybe no one ever knows what anybody else is actually talking about, but that's not a sad state. It's kind of the amazing, beautiful fact that we all still manage to be in conversation every day and function and get along.
Yeah.
When the stakes get higher and there's money involved and prestige
Yeah.
and privilege and canonization, suddenly it becomes like, you thought what? Like, that's not what I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating because, this is one of the disputes in the book, in a way, this dispute is another term that is quite prominent in your title and is really kind of like driving the narrative of your book. But one of the things that I love the most is that you don't try to resolve the dispute. You don't try to say like, oh, he is right and he is wrong. Or let me tell you actually what happened when these people were in the garage and doing drones for 8 hours, and I'll tell you who actually is the author. So you don't try to solve it, but you just as kind of like following this beautiful sort of like principle of versatility, you kind of like embrace it, and you use the dispute to get into this politics, very fraught politics of authorship that you think are the core of what minimalism is, more than maybe. Am I right in assuming that you think that this aspect of authorship are even more characteristic for you for what minimalism is than the more usual story about the musical material being kind of very reductive and minimal in that sense? Am I right in assuming that?
Yes, you are. Thank you. Thanks for reading into that. I don't know if I wrote that in there anywhere, but thank you for reading into that. Yeah, it is. I mean, I think this is kind of one of the things that I hope that people in our field, outside of just like minimalism studies, read it, because I hope that, I think if anything, people who are deeply invested in minimalism might not find all that much in it. Like there's no like close analyses of particular pieces. I don't much expand to introduce some forgotten figure, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's more about saying like, what is minimalism for music history? And I think the big kind of point I make there is that at that moment when the most prominent composer, strong author kind of figures that we have weren't really being that anymore, and were specifically railing against kind of their teachers' generation in the 50s in Columbia and Berkeley especially, and other places in the world too, but Columbia and Berkeley in this sense, and Juilliard, that that kind of image of the author as like the strong, like person, often white man person at his desk writing notes on paper and like the headshot, was kind of like becoming a less prominent thing, at least in the kind of dominant American imagination of what composition was. And really, to me, a big part of this, kind of in the more conspiratorial vein of it all, is that like minimalism kind of had to be turned inside out and into this kind of canonized form to sort of salvage an idea of authorship that I think they really, really successfully critiqued and revealed to be incomplete or kind of invented or fictional. And they were doing that, again, in very close parallel to people like John Coltrane or Ornette Coleman or free jazz players, or later on kind of punk and no-wave musicians. And so, I mean, there's kind of a sense in which they kind of had melted themselves into those scenes, and that was kind of working for them to a point, but it kind of, to me, seems like it wasn't working for musicology and for music journalists and for music critics and stuff, that they then kind of started to like pluck them out of that melting again in some sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of the mental image I have of it. I think that their critique of authorship was really, really functional and quite strong. But in most treatments of that period, they're treated as like naive or hypocritical or immature or utopian or whatever, and therefore kind of just reinserted back into the standard lineage of like, they followed on Schoenberg and Stockhausen and whoever else, and they were followed on by John Adams and Mark Mellitz and whoever else.
Yeah, I really like how, because your book begins with the story of Lamont Young and Conrad and Conrad picketing. And then when I kept going on, I was like, well, these people, by not using score, by challenging compositional convention, they were also picketing in a way, in the sense that they were staging a protest against a specific notion of authorship. So I like that very much. But at the same time, I was thinking, wow, and you do it really well in the book in saying like, well, the story had to become a teleology of some sort, of going from this early collaborative, not mature yet moment to the mature product of, as you said, like taking out the score out of those years of. So it's quite interesting how we kind of are used. So the author concept and the genius and the solitary sort of like composer is certainly something that we are very much attached, but so too this idea that the history of music needs to be a teleology, something that brings towards the next stage. And I think that your book kind of very nicely disrupt that in a very elegant way with this example of minimalism. But I am pretty sure, and I think this is food for thought for thousands of other projects, that as soon as you start zooming in a bit more on basically every composer and every moment, you'll find that we tend to tell a teleological narrative about them, a move towards an end. It was like, oh, there was an early period, a middle period, and a late period. Oh, and this composer started off this movement, and then these are the people that came later. How many times have you heard this kind of narratives when you talk about composers or musicians, or even when you read their bio in a concert program? So we're so used to it, and there's so much that you miss out, and sometimes it's more about the people are used to that format that then the story is written in that way than when actually certainly even if you think about Beethoven, yes, I'm bringing that up, sorry, but if I'm thinking about that, the moment people start talking about Beethoven and the three periods, early, middle, and late, early sounds like, oh, Beethoven wasn't yet there. The actual good stuff is at the end, is late works. How much are we predisposed when we think teleologically? And I think your book does an amazing work in unpacking that. And I think we should stress, sometimes when we pick up a book like this and we read the Names of Minimalism, the first thing is that you think like, oh, this is a book about minimalism. I'm not interested in that period or in those Names of Minimalism, those composers, so I shouldn't be reading it. Wrong, people, wrong, because people like Patrick do so much more work that is really supposed to give you so much food for thoughts. Even if you work on medieval music, in music in the 16th century, it doesn't quite matter elsewhere. I actually encourage you all to read this, because but so much more in general. If you're interested in music, in musicology, in music studies in general, you should go beyond these labels and say like, oh, that's where I'm interested, what I'm interested in. There's so much more interesting work being done that really speaks to the field as a whole and to categories that are important throughout authorship. Narratives of historiography, what historiography does, who does the policing.
Oh, I was thinking, I just had a thought that I didn't want to forget because what you're saying, but last night, this is off topic, but it's anecdotally relevant, but last night, the show Ted Lasso, that like a lot of people are watching, where it's like very sweet and very friendly and everyone's nice. And last night, my partner and I were just talking about how different it is than most TV, because most TV relies so much on that kind of like unspoken thing where there's some kind of like bad blood between two people, and the fact that it's simmering and it's going to explode at some point is the entire like kind of narrative interest and like that kind of thing. Whereas in Ted Lasso, they have to find actual other tricks to create like interest and continuity that aren't just like the bad blood thing. And so I make a similar kind of comparison in the book too about like kind of the whole like cop drama thing of like they used to be partners. It's that kind of thing where you can make like narrative interest without doing any work, by implying that things were complicated before. And so I think, to me, these kind of things are primarily, the historiography part of the title is these are all just stories. We try to make them as, rigorous as we can, but they're all just stories.
Yeah, they are.
I think a lot of historians don't often like hearing that, but I think it's basically just true. And so there's that part of this too.
I'm an historian, I love hearing that.
No, I know you do. Yeah, that's why we get along so well.
No, one of the sentences that I read in this book that really stayed with me, and I want you that it stays with you as well. This is Patrick talking, after complicating this picture of what an author is. Patrick says, quote, "A modality of authorship is chosen just as much as the pitches and rhythms associated with it." So imagine a music composer that not just chooses the notes or the medium, the tape, or the length, a lot of length in this case, but also deciding what kind of author they want to be or they are in relationship with interviewers, partners, collaborators. So think about that throughout music history, not just in Europe and colonial imaginers. Every act of musical authorship is a decision of what that thing is. So it's really kind of like a fabulous reminder to complicate that. Every time you engage with a music creator, it would be quite interesting to see what was authorship for them, or for in this particular case. Does it make any sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that was a big part of what I was thinking of in there, is that among this group of kind of authors, composers, I mean, I think the kind of the backstory to this too is that I guess during grad school, when I was this book was my dissertation. It's changed a fair bit, more and less. But during my kind of my dissertation was always this kind of thing at conferences where I would say that people are railing against authorship or critiquing authorship, and there was an invariably the question period for the first few years at least was kind of like, well, they still have their name on the piece, or their name is still on the album cover, or like they still are using a name. In this kind of way that the general idea, kind of the Western liberal subject and the author, kind of like stuck together as kind of a thing that has to necessarily like legally precede any kind of work that can happen and then be attached to it forever and ever and ever. But I guess what I try to do here is to point out that people have really, really, really different ways of being authors, especially as tape and records and concerts became opportunities. And so, so you mentioned before that I don't arbitrate the disputes, which I try not to do, and I've already heard from a few people who disagree and think I arbitrate them far too strongly, which is interesting too. But I mean, yeah, there's people in the book who like Philip Glass, I find a really kind of admirable person, is kind of at least in aspects of his working practice beyond his compositional style, because he used to talk in the 70s and stuff about how his whole goal, why he toured so much, was that he wanted to ensure that his ensemble, which was like his band, they toured together the world, had like health insurance. There were so many like days per year they had to play so you could get them health insurance and employ them and guarantee them unemployment benefits. And like that's a way of doing work. And there are other people in the book who like, have been spoken of as having like handed out contracts that ensure that you won't say this or that and you won't do this and that and you acknowledge that this person did everything here. And so I was trying to think of that kind of thing, that, what kind of, because it's also much about dispute and collaboration, what kind of people were the people being as they made their work, without getting too like judgmental or psychoanalytic or anything, but like, what material outcomes were produced by the way they tried to behave as artists working in the world. And some people provide really beautiful models, and other people you kind of think, why would they behave that way? That's terrible. Why would you do that to people? And that's important to me to kind of notice that.
Yeah, no, I enjoy this very much. And just to kind of like, to quote yourself again about something that you just said, against policed history, I insist that authors do not pre-exist their work, which I find fabulous. So like this idea that if you think of the author pre-existing, you're already policing history a bit, as we started this conversation, that asking who do you work on, which composer do you work on, you're sort of like pre-imposing that notion. You're assuming that someone, a specific author pre-exists the music, which is quite fascinating. Anything else you want to add before we open the floor to this fabulous group of people in front of us and the online and the online spectators? Anything that you'd like to say that we haven't touched on?
Trying to think. Yeah, I guess no, I don't know. No, I think I would just say that I hadn't really read the book since it came out until last night, preparing for our conversation, which you very generously invited me to have, and I felt it's such a kind of a nerve-wracking thing to release a book, because I kind of went from being stressed out about the fear of not finishing it or it not being accepted by peer reviewers or whatever, to now kind of being afraid of like, a negative review or someone being bothered by it or whatever. And so it's again, this kind of whole thing of this relationship where you can kind of change track the changing dynamics of it. But last night reading it, I felt like really excited by it too. And so I hope that there will be folks who read it and respond to it. And so I'm really grateful that you invited me to talk about it. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Yes.
And I think the last part is my favorite. So the people who read it, I know that I and many people in academia, grab a book, read the intro, footnotes, skim. I feel like the end is the good part.
Do you want to tell us something about the end, like before we open?
That's not a hook to like stay for the whole thing. It's just like if you're gonna read part of it, maybe read the last part. The last part is kind of like I tried to jump into my new research project, which is more about, it continues a lot of the themes around authorship and ownership and property, but to more being about graphic scores and kind of like really great indigenous noise music scenes right now, and I think reggae more and more. So it'll be kind of more around dispossession, and so the kind of last section is trying to talk about how a name like minimalism, the way we think that kind of adding more and more and more to it and making it bigger and bigger and broader does kind of benevolent, inclusive, beneficial work. And I often worry that whether under the name minimalism or under the name musicology or even music, that we should keep in mind that bringing in everything might also be a gesture of like grabbing and grabbing and grabbing. And so the last section is kind of about how that word made it difficult to talk about some things, or how words can kind of, like very often people will kind of, in some of the older scholarship of minimalism, they'd go back and they'd say, someone said minimalism here, but they weren't really using it precisely, or someone used it here and that was a really good early use. But like our way of talking about it has made other things harder to talk about. Like, or when I was writing the book, kind of in a more mundane sense, it was kind of during like the Marie Kondo like Netflix time too, and people were like, oh, minimalism, cool. I'm like, not that. And so I guess I keep finding it really important to talk about how, you know, words can often be things that kind of like sit on top of other things and make it hard for people and communities to talk about things that they used to talk about in a different way.
Yeah.
So that these words can kind of be like something parallel to a colonial or a gentrifying kind of force that make it hard for communities to talk about things that they used to talk about in very different contexts.
Yeah, they anchor things in a certain way.
Yeah.
And that's I find it, so the names of minimalism, so minimalism is also a name that you problematize in this sense.
And there's a really good other recent book too, and there's been 3 recent books on minimalism. Mine is just one, which is really exciting. I mentioned Carrie O'Brien and Will Robbins' On Minimalism, which is like I haven't actually seen it yet because it's like coming this week, but like it's a collection of like source readings and source texts that they contextualize. But also in 2020, Christophe Laveau wrote a book called We Have Always Been Minimalist, and he does a really amazing job of like tracking all the kind of dead-end terms that people used to name this particular repertoire. So not naming minimalism, but kind of saying names that journalists and critics and historians use to try to kind of hold together groups of artists like this in that moment. And it's so amazing to see how many, you know, dead ends there are and how many things don't stick. And that reminds you again of just of the kind of power of these sort of stories that we can tell, and how hard they can be to evade them once they set foot. And then also the dangers of letting them grow and contract and expand rather than saying, what is it? Like, what does it do? Where is it? How is it?
What sort of work it performs in a way. Yeah, so fascinating. And I'd say stay tuned for more for me and Patrick undoing the Viennese school or things that now. But it's a way of saying kind of like sometimes we use these names with them, and they are reiterating certain things that organize society in a certain way, and we're just unaware. So it's not about undoing it, but it's more about becoming aware of the baggages that these words, these names have. I would say enough from us chatting, and I'd love to open the floor for questions from the audience and from the online spectators. But so far, I see nothing on the YouTube chat. So people in the audience, ask away. Guillaume.
The way that you're describing right now the name and so on, what is contained, is that close to the concept of brand?
Brand?
A brand that you would say has been affixed to these creators without maybe necessarily all agreeing with it, but they all have to now abide by this idea of, or this brand, this image or logo or whichever. And is that something that you talk about in the book?
I do not, but I mean I think it would be similar to me. I don't have anything smart to say about brands, but I mean I think that comparison makes a lot of sense. In the 3rd chapter is very much about interviews that the kind of prominent minimalists gave in this period. And I do a lot of instances where I kind of like side by side compare like 2 interviews from years apart, and they say almost the exact same thing, like verbatim, in a pair of interviews. And so I suppose that'd be that kind of thing too, right? If you're on I mean, I'm sure if I had 10 of these, I'd say a lot of the exact same things too. I have just this one, so I get to get out with not repeating myself. But I think there's a similar thing, right? That there's this notion that composers need to build up kind of their body of concepts and works and stories and autobiographical tales. And so, I mean, one of the prominent ones is like Steve Reich, his name is attached to the idea of phasing or a gradual process. And that's kind of one of the sites of tension, is that someone like Terry Riley says, oh, I was also doing phasing at the same time when we were hanging out. And they kind of fall in these battles over, and the way the historians have tended to treat that is who did it first, who influenced whom, where is the proof, what documents can we call upon, which record releases, which dates. But a big part of it to me too is this kind of idea that it's a concept that names a set of practices that they're involved in, which I guess is kind of what brands do too, but I don't know much about brands.
One aspect I think of it is conflicts over brand. Like some of these composers could say, well, I claim property on this, and what you're doing is a derivative of what I'm owning this idea.
Yeah.
And that in copyright law, we cannot own an idea. We can own an expression of the idea.
And so one of the case of this kind of duo on the front too is that there was eventually in 2000, the one kind of official album release from this music of the 60s that they did, the Long, Long, Long Drones, and there's a very long story of it that I wrote about in there, but essentially one of the tapes ended up being released as a CD by a very small record label in Atlanta called Table of the Elements. Not very small, very, very important, but they ran small experimental kind of things. The owner, Jeff Hunt, I talked to a bit in here too. But so essentially, they released this CD without Lamont Young's permission, the person who'd wanted it to be very contained, and they issued it as equally by all 5 performers on the CD, which then led to Lamont Young taking out a copyright on the recording after the album had come out. So it's actually, the CD exists and it has a copyright, but there's also like a filed like US copyright by Lamont Young from like 2 weeks after Tony Conrad released the CD. So I don't know how many I'm sure there are other instances of that have happened too, but that's pretty strange. And again, this notion that they're both making a property claim in the exact same 40-minute long recording, that's essentially a garbled, horrible mess. You can't tell what's happening. It sounds terrible. It sounds like a bunch of tape noise and like modems connecting. I love it. I adore it, but it's not something worth building a career on, which is part of the point here in the book too. But I'm also now thinking part of the book too with the names is this idea of homonyms and the idea of when words cover things up. And so with branding, I'm also now thinking of like brands and like burning things into like animals and stuff. And there's that kind of idea can go in a lot of ways. When you physically burn your name into something, it's a different kind of action too than the kind of corporate idea of what branding is about. I don't know if that's an answer to all that. Thank you, Guillaume. Is that in that direction?
Yes,
Thank you.
If I can, it's kind of along those lines, but I mean, I'm sure you think about the legitimizing or branding, legitimizing by writing. The idea of music being, if it's either in written form or it's in a form on paper where you can see it and therefore it's transmitted, or whether it's on recording or whether it's written about. And so here you are in your own authorship. You're part of the deconstructing or legitimizing or telling the story. And don't you think that's really the biggest element it's why we place labels as well? The idea of placing labels is to try to identify something that's going on that's actually very hard to describe, whether it's an era or a period or a style. Like, can you talk a little bit about that struggle?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Thank you. I think it's part of the fun challenge. I think to me the always important thing is to try to account for these things in a way that doesn't like overstate any claims of how substantive or concrete these kind of things are. And I think tons of writers are really good at that. So it's not something that's like my idea, but it's just an important thing to me. And so I try to write. I mean, the book is pretty chaotic at times. Like I got a headache reading the intro a while ago one day. I'd already had a long day, but I was rereading the intro and I was like, whoa, this goes. So I love that and I enjoy it. But I think a big part of me is I kind of almost undercut almost everything I also say a lot of the time too. And I think this kind of thing of, like joking as I say things is important to me too. And it's, there's a certain degree of like privilege and self-dismissal in that too, as while I'm on camera and in this room with all of you at the university and everything. But I think it's just important to recognize that, to try to find ways to signal that the story you're telling is one way a story can be told. And then to me to kind of think about what the kind of ethical or narrative implications are of that framing of the relationships in play. And that a lot of the time it comes down to like in the case of a lot of these, I think again, getting very abstract here, but in some of these cases, like a lot of the pieces here that are scored are scores that were transcriptions from after the fact. And there's kind of these instances where scores and transcriptions are treated as if it's kind of the same, either way the person wrote it, what does it matter? But I think in terms of as a historian, they're definitely decidedly absolutely not the same. And in the sense of if one of these composers transcribes a tape of a group improvisation to submit to a Guggenheim grant, which happens in here, to claim property in that by writing it down does some kind of problematic, thefty, dispossessive things to me. But I think we've gotten used in a lot of cases to treating that as still just another instance of authorial inscription, but we need to be careful about what kind of timelines and narratives that upholds, or how sometimes writing music down can be stealing other people's music, or those kind of property claims that come into that stuff too. So.
And what about the role of the musicologist in that too? Like, I'm not trying to. I'm just curious because I feel like that element actually is so important from performed music or living music that's being made, and that dialogue between musicologist or perhaps any written media to help legitimize whatever is going on musically, which can't be somehow contained.
Yeah.
What about the role of musicologist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is again the kind of thing that I'm really glad that like Fabio and I and others in the department, and Michael's here, and Julia and Brian and plenty of other people in the department more broadly. But I guess I'm thinking in the academic area that it feels to me as if there's a real thought about like what are these disciplines and what is our job. And I think if someone was to ask me like to define musicology, like you use the word like legitimize, and that would have never even crossed my mind that was one of our jobs. And so this again falls into kind of that whole thing of these kind of homonymic trajectories of these words that I can say I'm a musicologist and everyone in the room has a different idea of what that means. And we get by, and that's functional and beautiful that we can manage to communicate at such cross purposes. But I mean, I hope that what my job isn't to legitimize things. But I think what the job is more, I mean, in kind of a pedagogic end, it's kind of to trust people, to trust their own listening, or to think about narrative structure. And when I was at University College Dublin for a postdoc last year, and my mentor there was Jamie Jones, who said dozens of wonderful things. But I watched her teach one day, and it was the first day of her undergrad class, and she was like, "I'm an ethnomusicologist. That means my job is to find ways to write words about sounds." It's like, cool. That's a good description. Like, you conduct and perform. I write words. So I think to me the big thing isn't about like who's legitimizing work, but more what kind of media relationship you have with music and sound. And to me, it's just I write stories about, hopefully factually grounded ones, and well researched and critical ones, but like stories about stuff. Yeah. And my mode is most often to go into ones that people have already written and point out how they assume some very strange things about authorship and property and owning things and stealing things and those kind of things.
Yeah, that reminds me, that anecdote about your mentor in Dublin reminds me kind of like me and Michael at the undergraduate orientation this year, that we had to explain to an audience what musicology and ethnomusicology were, and we came up with the same thing basically. And I was like, well, we should talk more about this.
This is important to talk about.
Yeah. We have a question from one of our remote attendees, Justin Kenneville.
Oh,
and
is it a real question?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
I love you, Justin, sorry.
Does streaming eliminate or further complicate authority in recordings of improv?
Streaming?
Yes.
As in like music streaming?
Yeah, so the former version of the question, like where do you see issues of authorship going as streaming becomes the main platform for new artists?
I don't know. I find that hard to respond to thinking in terms of the book. But I mean, I just taught a seminar that went really wonderfully, and some of the students are here. Thank you for coming. That was called Who Owns Music? And we got into streaming a little bit, and the way that there's a lot of conversation around streaming and kind of AI and kind of things as being very much the future and what benefits these offer to artists and on and on and on. But there's also a lot of very weird, creepy things about them, like the fact that if anyone's not heard of song funds, go home and Google Mercury Artists and the Hypnosis Song Fund, which essentially is just someone, there's a company who's insisting that because of Spotify and streaming monthly revenues that songs are now a more reliable investment property than gold or currency. And so he's essentially going around and buying up like Justin Bieber's catalog most recently. I think they own the entire Journey catalog. I forget who else, but basically there are investment funds of like venture capitalists buying up bulk song copyrights so that when Spotify receives that, I don't know, $1 billion a month payday of the subscriptions, they can now claim 2 or 3% of it. And next month they'll try to get 6 or 7% of it. And so I don't know about the particular question of improvisation or how that would tie in. I mean, again, this to me is all about, I guess, ownership and property in music. And there are people who are viewing songs as investable, locatable properties that can be, you can own like 1/3 of Neil Young's music or like 1/10 of Baby by Justin Bieber for investment purposes, right? And so I think that to me is the kind of thing where for all of the optimism towards what streaming allows and access and lower prices, that there are a lot of very dark, weird questions music scholars and music fans should ask themselves before we kind of just buy into it fully. And I know, in my undergrad class I taught last term, every single student had Spotify, and so they asked me if I would get Spotify to make like listening lists on there, and I was like, no. Because I have a real aversion to getting a streaming service account.
Right.
I buy lots of music at record stores and on iTunes, which makes me, I believe, very anachronistic in the modern world. But yeah, there's a weird way people are buying up songs as like properties, investment properties.
Yeah, it certainly makes a
Sorry.
Oh, yes. Go right ahead.
Finish your thought.
No. I was just saying like food for thought, like just in the same way as these artists were, especially when you think about collaboration. How I was thinking about this question and how streaming platform use names to make you navigate the platform in a certain way. And I'm thinking about that structure and how you find stuff, how you think about the stuff that you listen to, because it's presented through categories of...
Or you choose like workout, and you get whatever, but also, like Spotify is very much working on like that when you choose workout, it generates 2 hours of AI content that they don't need to pay anyone for.
Yeah.
And so these are kind of, again, the fears of what I think those streaming and AI companies are dreaming of right now.
Yeah, super interesting. Go right ahead, Alison.
How did commissioning factor into like this early era of the 60s and 70s of these composers, of this community of composers? Was that something that was being done?
I don't think. I'm just trying to think, because I don't want to just prattle and be wrong. I don't think any of them were getting commissions in the earliest kind of period I talk about here in the early 60s. One of the big draws of kind of the whole 60s New York romance is that it was very, very, very cheap. And so people were able to live there and kind of get cheap places to live and cheap instruments and stuff like that. Later on, commissioning became a big thing. Like kind of the first commissions I can think of were in the late 70s or early 80s for like Reich and Glass from kind of major American ensembles. And it was kind of this is kind of where chapter 4 starts, is that around that moment when like Steve Reich gets commissioned for an orchestral piece, all the magazines and newspapers were like, oh, minimalism is dead. They're now writing orchestral pieces and it's dead. And that was kind of the tone of the conversation. And then there's been 40 more years of minimalism by them or whatever else since. But I mean, one of the big kind of famous sort of commissioning dynamics is that Lamont Young and his partner Marian Zazela were given like bajillions, that's a ballpark figure, of dollars. And they moved into this like, what was the building called? It was like it's a massive like block-sized building in kind of the southern end of in downtown New York that they had like a 4-story building, and they had like a millions of dollars per year budget where they had a whole floor kind of performance space, and they had money to kind of be hiring assistants, and they've been running this beautiful sound and light installation called the Dream House kind of nonstop since the 60s, which is in their apartment right now, but it was in this massive space for years and years in the 80s because they were kind of the preferred artists, musicians of the de Menil family and kind of the oil money of that family. So this is the same family that kind of runs the Dia Beacon and the Dia galleries and all kind of minimal sculpture galleries. And so there were these instances of kind of some of the first commissioning being like, not here's a pocket of money, write me a piece. It was more like, here's millions of dollars to live and create as you will do for the next, I think it only lasted 7 or 8 years in Lamont Young's case, but he negotiated that for sure. I was very much about being like, his work is about durations, and he wanted somewhere where his Bosendorfer could sit at its beautiful just intonation tuning for months at a time and not waver in pitch and be tuned every day to ensure it didn't waver in pitch. And so he had very specific conditions. So kind of an odd idea of what commissions would be, but that was one of the very big kind of influxes of money into this group. Or like Tony Conrad was a professor at SUNY Buffalo for years too, so in terms of kind of funding for where his work came from. But his work then was mostly kind of film and performance art and stuff rather than music. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Caleb.
Yeah, thanks. I actually want to hop back to the comment before about Spotify and the investment fund going in this way. And you said something interesting, that the investment fund is wanting to offer you a chance to invest in the music. That's not what they're doing.
No, yeah, right.
They're giving you a chance to actually invest in the authorship and continuing on to do so, right? They're mimicking, these have been around for a couple of years at this point, but giant funds that invest in fine art. You may hate me for this, I have invested in those before. They're super interesting because you don't care what the actual object is that they're investing. They're a fund, you're alienated from that in some sense. All I care about is that they hold a few Picassos, a couple of Banksys, and that these names are the things that are floating out there that hopefully in 5 years they can turn around and sell for profit. Or in the case of the music, you're getting a dividend off of the sales that are attached to that name. So yeah. I don't know, so it's not a question of comment, but sort of linking your saying to streaming and things like that too, right? All of that depends on authorship. It actually has like the music itself in some ways is a secondary factor.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. Yeah, it's funny again, so a statement like investing in music, like what music means there is deeply ambiguous. Sure. And you're right, it's not what it sounded like. It's more that they are buying up the rights to receive the royalties from streaming sales. They're investing in the rights to be the benefactors of that money. And yeah, and they even, in Hypnosis is, I'm gonna get like blocked on the internet or something, saying hypnosis in front of a room of people. They're like investor reports or public reports, and they use the term proven songs, like capital P, capital S, as in like, don't stop believing, will probably never stop being a moneymaker for them month to month. So that's a proven song.
Proven song.
And I guess I think if musicology is anything, which it must be because I'm here, then it should be engaging a question like, what is a proven song? And what is it that, what has song and music, without legitimizing it, what has song and music become that venture capitalists are down to buy Don't Stop Believing and assume that it's infinite kind of capital returns, long term. Or, and it's always, in the same way that copyright has always been, that the people doing copyright policy and copyright investing always frame it as being about artists' rights. It's probably almost always not.
Not quite, yeah.
So this is kind of the future project stuff for gaming.
Yeah.
These questions of ownership and property and music and how this kind of stuff changes over time, how it kind of piggybacks on and assumes past relationships that we think are harmless and lovely and important, like, investing in music or paying artists or commissioning artists, when you're actually like spending money to remove money circulating in local music economies towards song funds and investment properties.
Well, I think that this is the perfect note to wrap up. You said, we had a very good discussion about your book, and you mentioned things that that interest and almost blossomed from this project into the new one and the direction of your work. So I just am excited for more of this. I can't wait to hear more. Thank you everyone for joining today. Remember to download this for free if you want, or even better, use the discount code.
There's a discount code for 30% off
for 30%
in the room
off.
and online, yeah.
Exactly, if you want the physical thing. But come back also for more questions about music. Next term we'll have really world famous guitar performer that's going to visit us in his first tourney through Canada, and we're going to ask them kind of a bit of question about how did they make it. They are also a YouTube phenomenon, and they started really doing that in their own bedroom kind of like recording. This was before the pandemic, and that's how it sustained themselves. So I'm sure that a lot of people in the department that study performance will want to know more about this sort of like almost entrepreneurship. We're thinking about another session on AI and music, so make sure to stay tuned about questions about music. But for now, it's everything, and I invite all of you to join us for the après, for our refreshments.
Thank you to Russ and Pat.
Thank you so much for the TV
style,
set
yeah.
and the set. Thank you again for Patty for joining us in this conversation.
Thanks,
Shall we?
Thank you. Thanks, Fabio.